as you
Good
all.
evening, sir.
Good evening, Dr. Virmani.
Hi, good evening.
Good evening.
So let me welcome you all to the Friday EGROW webinar series. As you know that the Friday webinar series, we try to bring in the best minds from across the world to come and speak to us on contemporary economic issues. We started this series as COVID set in. We have done about 210 such webinars. We have been very fortunate to have a blend, which we originally wanted and successful in achieving it, of speakers from India and abroad. We have had regulars flow of speakers from Harvard, from Stanford, London School of Economics, Princeton, and speakers from India too, touching on most important policy issues. EGROW Foundation is a research-based policy think tank set up in October 2018. It is in this very context that we had invited earlier two Nobel laureates, and they came to speak to us on very important issues of auction from Stanford and on economic development from Chicago. Today, continuing the same heritage, we have invited Professor Michael Spence, Nobel laureate, to come and speak to us on something which is extremely hot and extremely, I would say, most contemporary, and that is AI. I've heard him speak about a few weeks back when he was visiting Delhi, and we made him a request, and he's very kind to have accepted our invite to come and speak to us. To share this session today, we have Dr. Arvind Virmani, and to be the discussant for the issues, we have our in-house expert, Professor Dinesh Kumar from IIM Bangalore. Let me briefly introduce you to our chair for the day. Dr. Arvind Virmani is right now currently the member of Niti Aayog. He was chairman of the Foundation for Economic Growth and Welfare EGROW Foundation and president of the Forum for Strategic Initiatives before he took over as member of Niti Aayog. He's been a mentor to FICCI and member of RBI Technical Advisory Committee on Monetary Policy. Earlier, he was the executive director at the IMF, chief economic advisor, Ministry of Finance, and principal advisor, Planning Commission, presently NITI, then the Planning Commission. During his tenure, he advised on a host of economic policy reforms through hundreds of policy papers, notes, and reports to the committees. He has served as member Telecom Regulatory Authority of India and also as a director of another think tank, director and chief executive of the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. He has published 35 journal articles and 20 book chapters and written over 50 other working papers in the areas of macroeconomics, growth and finance, tax reform, international trade and tariffs, international relations, and national security strategy. He has been a key player in the reforms that took place in 1991. The speaker for the day is Nobel laureate Professor Michael Spence. He is the Philip H. Knight Professor Emeritus of Management in the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University, a senior fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution, and Council on Foreign Relations Distinguished Visiting Fellow. He is an adjunct professor at Virginia University and an honorary fellow of Magdalen College, Oxford. In 2001, he received the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences for his work in the field of information economics. He is the author of The Next Convergence, The Future of Economic Growth in a Multi-Speed World, published in 2011. He has served as Dean of the Stanford Business School from 90 to 99 and Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard from 1984 to 1990. He is a recipient of the famous John Kenneth Galbraith Prize for Excellence in Teaching and the John Bates Clark Medal, recognizing American economists under 40. The discussant for the day is Professor Dinesh Kumar. He was my colleague at IIM Bangalore. Incidentally, Professor Spence, I spent a year at Harvard in the same Faculty of Arts and Sciences, but I missed you. I was there from August 2003 to 2004. And then I came to Stanford. I was in the building next to yours. I was in economics department, and I spent a year and a half there. So I feel
Fantastic.
so to host you today. I have another colleague, Professor Dinesh Kumar, who was recently my colleague when I was at IIM Bangalore for about 6 years. He's a professor of decision sciences. And right now, he's also the Dean of Faculty. His major area of research is solving business problems using artificial intelligence. He has over 25 years of teaching and research experience. Before joining IIM Bangalore, he has worked at several reputed institutions across the world, including Federal Institute of Technology, Stevens Institute of Technology, Australian National University. He has also worked in an Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta. Obviously, he has published a number of research articles in leading academic journals. He was awarded the Best Young Teacher Award by the Association of Indian Management Institutions in 2003, and the Distinguished Professor Award in Data Sciences by Analytics India magazine in 2021. With this, I hand over to our chairman for the session today, Dr. Arvind Virmani, to please conduct the proceedings further. Dr. Virmani.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure. When Charan mentioned that Professor Spence is going to join us, I was very happy. We've interacted for many years, growth, and some of his very innovative ideas which he used to have when he was younger. I'm sure he has them still, but I've not kept up with them. But without further ado, as they say, let me invite you, Professor Michael Spence, to begin your talk. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Arvind. It's a pleasure to be with you. So when I was chatting about joining you today, I thought I'd talk briefly about a book that Gordon Brown and Mohammed Al-Arian and I have just written about the state of the global economy, and then move as quickly as I can to some thoughts on artificial intelligence. So let me share my screen if I can, and we'll see if it works. So let me ask you if that looks like it's on the screen.
Yeah.
All right, now I'm going to go back to the start. So, because I was fooling around with a video and I can't get it to give the sound to you, which is unfortunate. Anyway, so here we go. That's a brief introduction of me, and you've already covered that. This is the book that we wrote, published last year in the fall. In 2023. It was not long after artificial intelligence had sort of burst on the scene, and so I'm going to use it to kind of set the stage. So the way I think about the global economy is it's I'm going to cover this fairly quickly, and we can go back to any of it that you're interested in the conversation afterwards. Is a collision of three very powerful sets of forces. One is a set of shocks of increasing frequency and severity from climate, pandemics, wars, geopolitical tensions that are causing sort of major changes in the way the global economy is put together and the way it functions. The second is, I think, up until recently, at least in the West, somewhat less visible because we lived in a demand-constrained pattern of growth after the great financial crisis. So sort of big shifts on the supply side, didn't seem to matter very much. but they matter now. So it's reduced elasticity of the supply side and inability of the supply side to keep up has been the initial trigger for inflation, which we haven't seen for 3 to 4 decades, really since the Volcker era, in many of the countries, especially the developed ones. And finally, the third big item is, of course, these powerful scientific and technological transformations that are underway. I think of them as three: digital, and especially now Gen AI. There's an equally important, I think, from multiple perspectives, biomedical and life sciences revolution underway. And these two are going to intersect. I think there's a pretty general agreement that that the arrival of Gen AI and the biomedical and life science is going to turbocharge a revolution that's already underway. And there are examples of that already. And finally, we have this huge energy transition that's required on a global basis to achieve sustainability. And so the question is, why do we write the book? Because this is a pretty complex and confusing situation with supply chains changing, with disruptions all over the place, and then with big transformations coming. And we thought we would try to make a contribution to sorting that out. And so the way the book is constructed is we argue that you need to change the equation in some sense. Muhammad wanted the book to be called Changing the Equation, and they told him you couldn't name a book after arithmetic or mathematics. So so we gave up on that and ended up with permacrisis. But we need basically fairly substantial adjustments to growth models. We need new mindsets and frameworks for policies and macroeconomic management. Different mix of fiscal, monetary, industrial policy than we've typically operated with before. And we certainly need to try to arrest the process of fragmentation, or not arrest. I don't think reverse is the right word, but we need a new version of globalization that's realistic and recognizes the tensions and so on, the reasons for the fragmentation. And these are big and important, challenging items. So when we came out of the pandemic, there were a whole bunch of transitory, problems in global supply chains, and these have largely resolved themselves. The central banks bet that they were the only problems on the supply side, and in that they were basically wrong and had to change direction and arrived late on the scene in terms of dealing with the inflationary. But I don't have any doubt that they'll finally get the job done. Although, excuse me, it's turning out to be quite a bit harder than they thought. We just had another, inflation print in the United States, and it's kind of gotten stuck somewhere in the 3% or above neighborhood. So we'll see. But my view is that there are underlying problems on the supply side that are causing the supply side to not catch up with demand. So these are some of the transitory things that I won't dwell on. That picture is ocean shipping costs and so on. But the global supply chains in the pandemic were wound really tightly. And so when you deliver a shock of that magnitude and shut stuff down, they get way out of balance. And because they were wound tightly, when people went into what I call survival mode, they squeezed out whatever sort of inventory and other buffers there were in the system. That meant that when the demand came back, because of delayed purchasing and big fiscal programs that you all know about, the supply side didn't respond at all, and then we got these inflationary triggers. This is a picture of U.S. inflation. Up until relatively recently, it's ticked up again. And so, I won't spend a lot of time on monetary policy, but you can see that they arrived late in the game and they're fighting a tough battle. Europe is a little bit different. The economy is somewhat less strong than the American side. And this is Eurozone inflation. You can see the basically. Anyway, the main point I want to make is that the supply side has shifted in a fundamental way. And the reason I want to make this point is that it highlights the importance of the breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, because it's the single most powerful tool that we have to expand the supply side's capacity to produce in the face of this list of things that I've just put on the screen. So, sorry, got a little bit of a cold here. We lived in a world in which there were very powerful deflationary forces that came from emerging economy growth. And they were powerful enough to essentially make inflation a non-event in most of the developed world and beyond. That I've in some places called that the fading of that great powerful force, which I think is occurring now, the Lewis turning point in the global economy after W. Arthur Lewis and his models of development. But in addition, we have these shocks. We have diversification in supply chains, which is a very expensive process. And basically, supply chains used to be built on economic efficiency and comparative advantage grounds, and they are increasingly in the private sector, reinforced by policy, being built on grounds that have more to do with national security, economic security, et cetera. And it's causing fragmentation and a reconfiguration of those supply chains in just a huge major way. We have aging in economies that account for almost 80% of the global economy. That means lots of things: declining workforces in some cases, rising dependency ratios, pressure on fiscal space, and so on. The pandemic produced a big uptick in public debt. It's now globally well over 100% of global GDP. That's also true in the United States and in a number of other places where you wouldn't have expected it 10 or 15 years ago. And we have very striking declining productivity trends. I've looked at this data in detail for a range of developed economies, and the decade after the great financial crisis was an extreme version of the decline in productivity growth. And it occurred across the board. So if you take the high productivity sectors that use names, tech, finance, et cetera, they dropped. The low productivity sectors dropped to the point where the productivity growth was almost zero. So we're not getting any help in terms of supply chain constraints from productivity. In addition, we have labor shortages in most developed economies, in part because of the demographics and in part because, people have changed their labor market behavior. The way I describe it is the young people have decided, as a result of the pandemic experience and the work from home opportunities and so on, that they don't really want to work in environments that are inflexible, unsafe, low paid, and stressful. And so we have labor shortages in pretty much all the major employment sectors in the economy. So we add all this stuff up, you've got a supply chain pattern, a supply constrained pattern of growth that we haven't had for a long time. Now, we could sort of spend a lot of time on this and modify it, but I just wanted to sort of lay it out as a kind of backdrop to what we're going to sort of talk about later. There's a few graphs here that I'll send over and share with you. This is my kind of crude version of the Lewis turning point in the global economy, where basically when you have a surge in demand for a long period of time, the supply side simply responded to it in quantity terms with relatively little price pressure. That's no longer true. This is the consumer price index. So you can see these blue things down here. This is tradable, mostly tradable goods. Those are in nominal terms. So the real decline in those prices, and those are declines in nominal terms in those prices, for things like toys, TVs, et cetera. If you do it in real terms, the effect is even more dramatic. So that's the story on the supply side. If we stay in that condition, we are going to continue to experience a whole lot of things. Inflation will be in play. The likely outcome, and I admit this is, debatable and controversial, is we will have higher real interest rates and higher costs of capital. The productivity trends will continue to decline. We'll have slow global growth. And then we'll have adjustments in debt levels, sustainable debt levels at multiple levels, sovereign, corporate, etc., and lots of accidents along the way, because you basically have a generation and a half of people who have lived in a world in which, at least in the developed countries, but more broadly than that, in a world in which inflation was a non-issue. And those mindsets don't change instantly. We had about a year ago some major bank failures in the United States. Actually, in terms of aggregate, capital amounts, they were larger than the failures in the great financial crisis. And they were basically failure to manage interest rate risk. My friend Mohammed Al-Arian says, banks have to manage interest rate risk, credit risk, regulatory risk, and and compliance risk. And probably the simplest one, and conceptually, is interest rate risk, but they didn't manage it. And the Silicon Valley Bank is a story you all know, was a classic example of that. Okay, and these are the productivity trends. This is a little hard to read, but basically what you'll discover when you this breaks down, it's the American economy, and it breaks it down into the tradable and the non-tradable side of the economy. So roughly speaking, in an economy like the United States, a typical, developed, relatively high income economy, the tradable side is about a third of the overall value added in the economy, and the non-tradable is about 2/3. The employment is different. Employment is about 80%, almost 80% in non-tradable. The more productive part is the tradable part. It's about half manufacturing and half services. These are, services that trade internationally and so on. And what you discover is that the productivity trends are negative, and when you look at the period after the great financial crisis, 2010 to 2019, the numbers are really strikingly low. And that puts us in I think, a difficult position with respect to sustainable growth. Now, I know that people think the American economy, relatively speaking, is relatively healthy. That's true. Unemployment's low and so on. But it is, well below some version of potential, depending on whether you can reverse some of these trends. So that's basically the whole story. I'm going to here's the sovereign debt levels. You can see the pandemic, quite appropriately, I might add, produced a very large uptick in sovereign debt. The reason for that is, countries that could afford it basically used their fiscal capacity to buffer the shock, both to the household sector and the corporate sector. In the household sector, to prevent balance sheet damage, using up their savings, and in the corporate sector to prevent loss of, to the extent they could, prevent loss of businesses. There's nothing wrong with that response, but the longer term impact of it is is an increase in the sovereign debt levels, which in a rising interest rate environment, is more problematic than it would have been in the kind of zero to negative interest rate environment that we lived in, for over a decade after the great financial crisis. So fiscal space is declining quickly, and if you ask yourself, well, where are we going to get the resources to invest $3, $4, or $5 trillion incrementally in the energy transition? I think there's some unanswered questions in this area that, in other words, there's an adding up problem here that, hasn't been totally sort of thought through. So here we go.
So, right.
Go ahead. Yeah. Do you want to interrupt?
Yeah. No, as you
question?
finish. No, this part of it, have you finished? I want to say a little after that, but you finished this. Yeah.
No. I mean, this is just aging. So, what, again, I'll leave this behind with you, but basically the aging countries, which I've listed here, in terms of GDP, account for, approximately 78% of global GDP. Now, there's a very large part of the world that's not aging, right? And, about 2/3 of the world's population lives in countries that are sort of quite young and not in the aging category, meaning low fertility rates, rising, longevity, and all those things that go with it. But at the moment, they account for only 22% of global GDP. Now, when India finishes, its impressive growth run, this pattern is going to change again because India will be a young country whose share in global GDP will keep increasing. So this is a sort of snapshot of the present situation. But right now, aging is a constraining factor with respect to growth, and to some extent, we're out of equilibrium. I think I've covered enough of this, so I'm going to go on to AI. But Arvind, let me turn it over to you for a second.
Right. So I'm kind of in two minds whether I should interrupt the discussion, but I think probably should we have the discussion together at the end, but what I can do is put a few issues on the table and then maybe we can come back to it, right? Is that okay? Yeah. So I just want to make from an Indian perspective, the way I look at the world. Purely from an Indian perspective. So there are kind of 3 points I want to make, and we can leave it on the table and maybe you can come back to it after you finish. So one is the shocks, right through the pandemic. When I was at EGROW, we wrote a bunch of papers, and one of the issues which kept coming to my mind is that I wasn't sure, I think for the first time in many, I don't know, half a century or whatever, you had a whole series of shocks. So when I think of a shock, it disturbs something and then it gradually goes back to normal, some kind of a normal. But you had a repeated series of shocks, and I wasn't sure how to think about them. That are they just superimposed? Are they multiplicative? Are they interacting? So that's an issue which, if you've read or thought about or so on, would be interesting, to clarify what happened here. But we anticipated the shock. We said that the supply side was going to be disrupted, but what I didn't anticipate was another series of shocks. Next shock, third shock, fourth shock, and then it got very confusing how to analyze it. So I just want to leave it at that. The first shock, I think we did a great job. We have several papers in EGROW where we were kind of almost predictive, better than anybody else and before anybody else. But let me leave that. So second issue is the demographic. Again, as I said, I'm not disagreeing with what you said, but I just want to put down the Indian perspective. So I've also been looking at the demography. You're aware that we are thinking of this India 2047 or whatever, and it turns out that for the next 30 years, India is the only country which is going to gain global share in terms of working age population. So all the countries you mentioned, everybody's in declining share of working age. China, of course, everybody talks about, but every other potential competitor of India, like Thailand, Malaysia, you name it, they are all going to be losing share. So in some sense, India is in a kind of a unique position, at least till the African countries, come up. So India for the next, 15 years, 20 years, whatever you want to say, after which perhaps Africa. So in this period, there are two things which I focused on, and I leave them again, as I said, for you. One is the manufacturing supply chains, right? So India is the only country which has the scale. We can be there in low scale, middle scale, high scale, you name it. We have the scale, and we can, in principle, have the skilled labor to supply to the world, right? So the manufacturing supply chains, labor intensive, semi-skilled, medium skilled, whatever. So that's one issue, and I don't know how you look at it, but I have been looking at it very intensively from the view of attracting it and, in a sense, solving part of your supply side problem. The second aspect of this is I expect a huge unbundling of social services, and that has implications. And the implications interact with the anti-migration sentiments, which, of course, have been rising in Europe, but from what I see from outside, it's rising even in the US, and will therefore mean that the unbundling will mean only the critical things which have to be done physically will be done in the USA. And just to take an example, much of the other stuff will go to India and other countries. Again, because of scale, I mentioned India. So that's the second thing. And I mean, even health services, I give rather an extreme example. When you are monitoring aged people or chronically ill patients, it can all be done electronically from India. There could be people sitting here watching, and you could alert somebody there if some crisis happens, right? And the whole structure of that service could change with people, emergency teams going to wherever they are needed. So unbundling of services and transfer of the electronic part of it to India. Just to conclude, for example, the e-business services have been the fastest growing element of services. I remember some vague figure like 275% over the last 3 years, and India's share is actually rising in that. So that's just an example of what could happen. So I'll just leave you with these three issues, and perhaps, I don't know, you can come back to it after you finish the rest of your talk.
No, well, actually, let me respond to it now. First of all, this is a very important point. So I think this is on the repeated shocks. So you're right. If you have one or a small number, or they don't cover the entire global economy. I mean, if you just look at climate shocks, for example, you can't find a place in the globe in which they haven't occurred, whether it's a drought, or Pakistan, sort of a third underwater, or you can't go any place in the globe. And so what this means is that, one, these shocks are macroeconomic events. Two, eventually, because they're there, take the tsunami in Japan, Arvind, okay? Mm-hmm. Everybody knows that shut down the automobile industry for a while, because there was one critical little part that came from that part of Japan. But did the global supply chain significantly, diversify their sourcing? In spite of much talk, the answer is no, because these were sufficiently isolated, and now they're not. And so what you're seeing is that company after company in various parts of the global supply chains are actually diversifying their sourcing. Many people think it's the response to geopolitical tensions, but it's actually the response to a whole lot of stuff. Maybe geopolitical tensions are the most important ones, but and then you have this overlay of, there's quite a lot of this in the book, the overlay of the national security issues, which is producing, further disruptions with respect to both trade and capital investment and technology flows, all three, and people, the whole shebang, right? I have AI friends at Stanford. They couldn't visit China, now. It's just not possible, right? 5 years ago, they were all talking to each other. This is a completely different world. So I think, so basically what the shocks are now sufficiently severe and frequent, and we're going to expect more of them. 2 wars. When we wrote the book, we didn't expect the second war. Unless something changes pretty dramatically, this pattern of responding to risk is going to continue, and it's going to be an expensive process. Hell, look at here in Europe, we're diversifying away from dependence on Russian fossil fuels. It's really expensive when you do it at high speed. So I think you're right. It's hard to figure out, in great detail, but there's a huge difference, which is your point, between isolated shocks and persistent patterns that, kind of hit almost everywhere, right? One of the things you can see that's happening is, we're building semiconductor plants, meaning the fabs, with the help of TSMC in Arizona, right? Now, why are we doing that? Do we really want to produce all our semiconductors in the United States, the ones that have 3 and 2 nanometer spacing between the transistors? No. What we want to do is make sure that if the world goes badly, especially with respect to our strategic competition with China, we know how to do it. We can scale it up if we have to. Right now, we don't know how to do it, right? Samsung and TSMC are in a league of their own. with respect to, the most advanced semiconductors. I'm not talking about design. I'm talking about actually making them, right? That's going to change. India will develop this capability. China will eventually get there. We're going to bring some of it home. Just a different world, right? So it's hard to lay it out in detail, but home shoring, friend shoring, near shoring, etc. Second point, I did not mean to dismiss the notion that there was the potential for an extension of the deflationary forces that we associate with EM growth and China particularly. And if India steps into this in a major way, and I believe it's starting to happen, but it's not yet completely obvious, that is a game changer, right? That will restore a fair amount of the supply side capabilities. And to be perfectly honest, I hope it happens. So Apple's now producing, I don't know, let's call it 15% of their most advanced iPhones in India. I imagine that number will continue to rise. I look at these data pretty carefully like you do. Right now, the direction of foreign direct investment into India overall, as opposed to in the case of Apple, is downward, right? So that's going to have to reverse, I would guess, in order, for the full force of what you just described. But anyway, bottom line is I agree with you. I think the other potential, which you mentioned, is Africa. And I think this is a question of timing. So the African countries are still, many of them low income countries. They've been, knocked way off balance by the pandemic, the loss of fiscal capacity and so on. And, growth is hard anyway, as you and I both know. So, at some point they may appear as major forces connected to the kind of global economy in a way that they're not now. And when that happens, that will reinforce the trend that you just described. So I hope all that happens, and we're not totally relied on technology to relieve the supply chain constraints. But it's an important point you make, especially in the manufacturing area. On the unbundling of services, I think for me this is an open question. Yes, you can outsource. Trade and services is growing like 30% a year. India's share is increasing. A lot of this stuff doesn't have to be done at home. On the other hand, if you look at sort of a combination of Gen AI and whatnot, you've got a competition for people. And so I think that's an equation that, which I can't solve right now. I think it's too hard. It's the early days, but not to dismiss it. Okay.
So sorry, just a clarification on that. So, they're right, because what you're saying is the AI could multiply the thing, so you don't have to outsource it. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yeah. No, I mean, these are very important things that maybe I just. One of the major breakthroughs in AI before we got to Gen AI was image recognition. Basically, in 2015, the neural network version of AI, image object recognition, passed the average human, and that's the standard benchmark we use in AI. And so you can use this to detect, do radiology reasonably well. You can detect skin cancers reasonably accurately. And when I talk to my students about this, they say, well, yeah, but I'll still go to the dermatologist. And I say, well, that's fine, but 85% of the world's population doesn't live near a dermatologist, right? So even if it's not, it doesn't beat the dermatologist, it's as an element of inclusive preventive primary care, and you see the same thing, you've got the world's best digital financial structure in India.
I've got it. I just for the clarification, because anyway you're going to speak on AI, so let's move to that. I got it.
Yeah. So I just, but I wanted to make that point because we have AIs that are superhuman, we have AIs that are about at human level, and we have AIs that are subhuman. not up to, human performance. And
Right.
I routinely find people dismiss the ones that are below the human benchmark too
Yeah.
quickly. All right.
Right.
Okay. So here we go. Uh, um,
So
there's
the
a little
next,
bit here.
yeah.
Go ahead.
No. Go ahead. I'm handing it back to you for your
All right.
next part. Your,
Okay.
because you want to speak on AI, right?
I do. I do. So here we go.
Yeah. So let's move to that. We can come back. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So here's an example of AI. It's not quite Gen AI. This is called AlphaFold. DeepMind did it. But what they basically did is that over a 2-year period, they predicted the three-dimensional structure of proteins, which is from the amino acid sequence that defines a protein. This is a crucial thing to know when you're doing biological research or developing vaccines or drugs or anything else. It's very labor intensive in the lab. And if this prediction machine gives you a huge head start. So they succeeded. And they have predicted the three-dimensional structure of the 200 million known proteins in the world and published it as an open source database. So anybody in the world, regardless of where they are, properly trained, can go look up this. I mean, in using the language of economics, applied to biology, this is a huge productivity enhancer, right? And it's just one of many things that's happening sort of in that world. So here are the breakthroughs in AI. We had handwriting recognition, speech recognition, image recognition. You can see the human benchmark. They're all either up there or past it. Image recognition was about 2015. Huge range of applications, very hard for robotics or autonomous vehicles to function if they can't see anything. And now we have reading comprehension, language understanding, and the Gen AI models. So this is happening, at incredible speed. And the image recognition was interesting. If you listen to Jeff Hinton, is one of the founders of, the current generation of artificial neural network version of our artificial intelligence, basically people were trying to do image recognition without, the machine learning version. And something that doesn't happen very often in a controversial area of science or technology is that the people who weren't using, the kind of current generation of AI, machine learning capabilities literally switched overnight because they were losing in the competition that Fei Li organized around image recognition. They were losing so badly that everybody gave up on the old models, and which was trying to define the characteristics of, a chair, a cat, and so on. So here we go. Go. So why is Gen AI such? Think of this as large language models. They're about to become multimodal, and that's important and interesting. Why are they basically, attracting so much attention and have such huge potential? One of them is that for the first time, they have what is often called domain switching capability. So all previous versions of AI solved the problem, right? I mean, in a specific domain, right? Figure out win the game of Go, figure out what proteins look like, identify images. But these things talk to each other. They have a human-like ability to change domains. So you can talk to them about the Italian Renaissance and switch to inflation, and then do computer coding and ask it a math question, and you don't have to tell it what the subject is, or what we're trying to do here. It just knows, right? If this is, I think, why many, not everybody, but most people think that this is isn't just imitating human intelligence in some kind of brute force way, but is an element of human intelligence. And it's probably a step in the direction of artificial general intelligence, because previously it was a unique human capability. The implication of being able to sort of do almost anything in response to interactively with humans is that it's very hard to find a place in the economy where there isn't an interesting looking application, right? You can go almost anywhere. I'll mention some of them as we go along. The second is accessibility, right? So you don't need technical training to use this. ChatGPT had 100 million users in the first 2 months. That's just never happened before. And so the combination of these things plus the range makes them, for using economic terminology, a sort of super general purpose technology. So then the question is, well, what's the model? Now, I've just listed some, areas where there's, clear evidence that this is going to happen. What's going on now? There's an intense process of experimentation and exploration, in virtually every sector of the economy and the scientific community and whatnot. I listened to a guy last night who's a finance professor at Bocconi University. He said he spent the entire day, doing research with the current generation of artificial intelligence. And he reported to these young people that basically the research he was doing, he couldn't do a year ago, literally could not do, because the machines do things that, that we aren't capable of. Second point I want to make is that there is a very serious potential problem, which I call automation. I and others call automation bias. So there is an element of automation in this. These things write the first draft of almost anything, doctors' reports, computer codes, and whatnot. They're not good enough to write the final version, and it's not wise to let them do it. So I think the right model, this is what James Manika and I argue in the paper that I sent along, that was published in Foreign Affairs, is probably the best way to think about this is they're powerful digital assistants, sometimes superhuman powerful, save an enormous amount of time. I mean, doctors probably can spend 30% of their time writing reports they have to write, probably save 80% of that 30% time with these things. And this is just one example. You got to be careful. I mean, a lawyer in the early days of ChatGPT, a lawyer handed in a legal brief that had been written and without editing by ChatGPT. Unfortunately, ChatGPT made up all the legal precedent as it cites. These are called hallucinations. And they make stuff up unless they're equipped with some fact-checking things, capabilities, which they are being equipped with now. Bottom line is, this is not full-blown, full-scale automation. This is augmentation and machine-human collaboration is the best way to think about the model, but with enormous potential effects in terms of productivity. Some people worry that the productivity effects will be so large that we'll lose employment. We're going to lose employment in some sectors of the economy. I think it's an open question. I'm not terribly worried about losing net loss of employment in the economy, because usually when you get a big productivity surge, then you get an expansion in the economy. But if you look at it from a microeconomic point of view, there'll be lots of turbulence and chaos and things moving around. Let me give an example. The AIs write the first draft of media copy, right? Do I think we're going to need as many people writing media copy as that we have now? Probably not. But it also writes the first draft of computer software. So people often say, I mean, you can read this every day, we're going to need fewer software engineers. And I think to myself, well, we're building entire economies on software. Are we absolutely sure that a productivity surge there will lead to a decline in the demand for software engineers? I think that's an open question, but I wouldn't bet that we're going to need fewer software engineers as we build these economies on software. So you get the idea. There's a study by Eric Brynjolfsson and colleagues on it's a Gen AI application in the customer service area in a tech sector, and they trained the AI on thousands and thousands of hours of audio recordings of customer service, customer interactions. There's this, people phoning up and saying, I can't connect to the network, or I can't connect to the cloud computing system or some such thing. And can you help me? So they trained it on the audio recordings and the performance measures, standard performance measures. Did the customer service agent solve the problem? How long did it take to solve the problem? Did they make the customer angry on the way through, etc.? And then they tested it by giving it to basically half the customer service agents and not to the other half. Productivity effect overall was 14%, almost immediately. But the second part was even more interesting. For the least experienced customer service agents, the one who hadn't been doing this for a long time, the productivity effect was something like 35%. And which is interesting from 2 points of view. One, there's a kind of leveling up effect, and two, you realize what the AI is doing. It's delivering a kind of curated version of the aggregate experience of customer service agents back in an actionable form, so that you can sort of take advantage of that. And probably it can aggregate that stuff better than humans can, and certainly transmit it once it's aggregated. So this is I think a pretty interesting example. I asked Nanda Nilekani, during the trip that I really enjoyed in India, where I saw some of you, what he thought about this leveling up effect, and he said, I don't think we'll see that as much in software development as we see it in customer service, because the software engineers already kind of know what they're doing. This is interesting. There's a whole bunch of interesting things that we'll learn over time that have to do with this kind of thing. This is Jeff Hinton gave a lecture that some of you may be interested in at Oxford. It was the main annual lecture, the big public one that Oxford did at Oxford. And he gave ChatGPT, I think it was ChatGPT 4, maybe 3.5, the following problem. And basically it got it exactly right. And this is me. I gave it the following math problem. This is a simple thing that kids learn, when they're taking, doing algebra and whatnot. And again, that ChatGPT, basically, this is a screenshot. I did not edit ChatGPT 4's answer. This is literally what it said. This solved the problem overnight. These things are just enormously powerful. They learn things in a surprising way. James Manika told me that when they were developing BARD, which is now migrated to a more powerful version called Gemini at Google, in the latter stages of developing BARD, they gave it some prompts in Bengali, and they expected it to do nothing with that because it hadn't really been trained on anything in Bengali. And they kind of left it alone for a while, and they came back, and BARD had mastered Bengali, went on the internet, and went through a whole bunch of hoovered up some stuff on the internet in Bengali, and it had essentially added Bengali to its linguistic capabilities. There's some awfully interesting applications of this for people, for translation purposes. The CEO and chairman of the Times of India told me that they thought, when I was visiting, they thought they could produce, pretty good translations and publish them on the internet in 28 languages in India without an excessive cost burden. And a young guy who does translation for a living, high quality translations in India, told me when I visited that, the wonderful thing about the AIs is not that they do the whole translation. You still need the human for the kind of, subtle characteristics. But he said there's a hugely boring part of translation, that makes it a really big slog. And he said that the AIs basically take care of the boring part and let people like him focus on the really interesting parts. So the paper where we argue that there's a potential huge productivity thing is this one. It's in Foreign Affairs for anybody who's interested. This is one of the best early studies of the impact of Gen AI at the McKinsey Global Institute, and it predicts a fairly immediate and huge $4.4 trillion productivity-based benefit, almost, you know, in a very conservative way. It's a very interesting document. The last thing I wanted to talk about is robotics. So robotics is kind of different, but we want this to impact not just the knowledge economy, which admittedly is sort of everywhere. Sometimes people think the knowledge economy is sort of like in finance and tech and management and stuff like that. It's actually everywhere. So there's a big important part of the knowledge economy in hospitals, in what nurses do. And there's every reason to believe that the Gen AIs will turn out to be useful assistants, both to people and to systems in those contexts, and make a productivity contribution. But still, the AIs at the moment are in the general category that's, you know, euphemistically referred to as the knowledge economy. We would like it, you know, to extend, or like the impact, you know, to extend to what sometimes called the blue collar economy. And robotics up until Gen AI has had severe limitations. I mean, they're basically programmed, but they don't kind of do what they're told. So they work in structured environments. Structured environments are the equivalent of limited domains in AI, in Gen AI. And so the question is Gen AI going to make a difference? And I think the answer is yes, because it enables a kind of machine-human collaboration where each of them has strengths. Like human beings process, for example, and most people don't think about this, human beings process, because we're wired this way, rapidly evolving, very complex visual and other, you know, sensory environments. And we do this at a very early stage. And the reasons, and we do it with almost zero latency. By that I mean, it doesn't take us 5 seconds to determine that there's a bear chasing us. You know, right now, it takes anything that sounds like artificial intelligence a huge amount of time to figure out sort of what's going. Basically, robots don't have this capability. But what's interesting is that Gen AI may advance robotics in unstructured environments in a very interesting way. This can't be full automation, right? It just won't work. But the machine-human collaboration version of it might work. Now, this is the AI. Now, unfortunately, this is not, the sound isn't going to get through to you, so I'm going to stop with this. But maybe what I should do is just send it along, so I'll tell you what this thing does. It's a human interacting with a robot that's equipped with essentially Gen AI, a large language model, so it can interact with the human, and has a reasonable amount of manual dexterity. And if you watch this thing and listen to the human robot interaction, what you realize is that the robot's pretty effective. It can interact with the human, but the latency is still really quite strikingly large. So I'll try, I pushed share. Now I'll see if, so can you hear it? Okay. So there's more to talk about, but I'll send that along. I find this very striking. So let me stop there and see if we can pick up some of the issues that you raised before and or other issues. Who's up?
Hi, Dr. Charan Singh. Should I go now or?
You're muted.
Sorry. Oh, I was muted. Sorry.
You're muted.
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah. Professor?
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Professor, for wonderful session and a lot of insights. I'm not an economist, but I work in the area of artificial intelligence, and a lot of things that you mentioned during your talk about AI, Gen AI, basically what I do on a day-to-day basis. So in the
Good.
first part, you covered upon issues like economic slowdown, inflation, supply chain related issues, productivity, and of
Right.
course, there are a lot of geopolitical issues and so on, right? From an economic perspective. The question is, can AI help us, right, to solve, at least to some extent, the problems that we are facing?
Right.
Now, my view is, of course, many may agree or disagree. See, AI is something which is becoming very powerful, right? So today, the wealth creation across the globe is through AI in a large extent. For example, if you look at Amazon, right, their recommender system, there was one study by McKinsey. Their recommender system generates about 35% of Amazon's revenue.
Yep.
So Amazon's global revenue is more than $500 billion. So we are talking about $175 billion through just one algorithm. And I
That's
guess
right.
you may know more than me, there are about 150 countries whose GDP is less than $175 billion, right?
That's right.
So that's the kind of power that we are talking about when we use AI. And another example that comes to my mind is Target, which used it in a very, very innovative way. They were predicting which customer is pregnant, right? It's famously called Target's pregnancy prediction. And Charles Duhigg, in his Power of Habit book, he talks a lot about this particular algorithm. And he goes on to claim that their revenue in mom and baby products increased by more than $1 billion. Again, just
Yeah.
one simple algorithm. So just talking about the kind of wealth that AI is creating. But if you look at AI, how organizations are using, right? So one is innovation. In my belief, that a lot of innovation today is driven by AI. And in your paper on the coming AI economic revolution, you do talk about how healthcare is benefiting through AI. In fact, you may already seen there was a video by Sundar Pichai, and he basically says that I can look at somebody's eye scan and tell whether this person will get heart attack in the next 5 years, right? So
Yep.
basically, it is moving the entire healthcare from invasive procedure to non-invasive procedure, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
beautiful thing about AI is that it's not only for big corporates. In fact, we did a project with one of the startups in India based out of Hyderabad, and we wanted to predict neonatal sepsis in case of newborn babies or less than 2 year old, whether we can predict sepsis using non-invasive parameters. Otherwise, you have to do blood culture tests to do that, right? There's a lot of innovation which is driven by AI today. So that's one of the reasons probably there is a wealth creation and increase in productivity and so on. The second is automation, right? So today, a lot of things are getting automated. And in your book, in your paper, you did mention that probably about 10% of the jobs are going to disappear because of the automation. Some of these skills may become irrelevant, right?
Mm-hmm.
But some of
Yep.
these automations also increasing productivity in a large extent. So, for example, a lot of warehouses today are completely automated, right? And there's the one example that comes to my mind is online grocery store based out of UK, Ocado, and their entire warehouse operation is automated. Basically, the machine learning algorithms run the entire thing, right? The third way companies use AI is insights and intelligence, right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
in this case, probably, recommender system is one of them, but I can ask different question: who will default in the loan repayment, right?
Yep.
Or which employee will leave? So there are important questions at an organization level, and it helps to find answer to that. The fourth one you do mention about that in detail is the intelligent agents, right? In your paper, and there's also ambient intelligent systems, which is
Yep.
becoming more and more popular because we did a project with one of the, I can give two examples. One is one company asked us, can you predict whether there'll be fire in the plant in the next 15 minutes? And
Yep.
this is a paper manufacturing company, and then the fire is dangerous because the entire plant can go up in flames. So that be very, very
Right.
careful to predict
Yeah.
there will be fire. Now, these capabilities didn't exist, right? It was manually done. People sitting and watching the cameras, looking for ambers coming out of their manufacturing system, and the temperature is usually more than 350 degrees centigrade and so on. We also did another project recently. This is for one of the oil and gas extraction, and they get a lot of alarms from their sensors. And many times these are false alarms. So deviation from acceptable parameters, whenever that happens, there is an alarm, but then the same problem keeps sending many alarms. And now the shift engineers are worried and they're trying to firefight and figure out what's going on in the plant. So they were asking, okay, there are a lot of these ambient systems, sensors, and so on. And can we actually use the data to predict whether it is alarm chattering or a genuine alarm, right?
Yeah.
So we already
Right.
see a lot of applications of AI which
Yeah.
increases productivity, right? And you talk about that in detail. But there are also concerns which is related to the job loss, right? Now, one concern I have is as the productivity increases, the organization may think, okay, I can achieve this job using 4 people instead of 10 people,
Hmm.
right? And they have the tendency to fire the remaining 6. So this we are observing because in India, specifically during this year, a lot of these premier schools, when they talk about their final year job placements, they think that they are finding it difficult this year, right? And certainly one part of the blame is AI, especially areas like consulting companies and like tasks which used to take like 4 people, they need just 1 thanks to chat GPT, because analysis in general, generative AI and large language models and so on, it is making them more efficient, and they're finding that we don't need so many people, right? So that is a serious concern that we have, and as a professor and with a responsibility to ensure all our students are placed in the job market and so on. So when the productivity increases, is there a danger that we are going to get into a situation where the jobs are going to become difficult, right?
Yeah.
Is AI generating jobs that it is replacing? And in your paper, you do discuss that probably the white collar jobs are going to be in trouble, not the blue
Some.
collar jobs, right?
Some.
And so that's a concern that I have. Probably you can give us more insights into that, especially what is going to happen to our job market and what is the kind of future skills that the students will require. What will be the future of skill, right? Some of these things, if we can, enlighten us, that will be great.
Thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry, I just want to put down 2 things for you, and then you can address all of them.
Okay.
So again, I'm kind of coming from. I've already given the background, right? I have to worry about, for example, let me start the other way. Let me pick up this issue of leveling up. I did a paper in 2006 in the erstwhile Planning Commission, where I was asked to review the government's health, education, and other services.
Yeah.
It's easiest to do it this way. That's why I'm putting it like this. Otherwise, I have to go round and round thinking of words. So what I came to the conclusion was that given our large population spread over the rural areas, lack of connectivity, all that you're kind of familiar with, right? That the only way we could raise the quality of the health and education services was through some kind of a digital internet, that sort of a thing. So since then, I mean, in those days, we used to have something, and there's a question, though it may not sound like it. Expert systems. I used to think of expert systems, which is, I think, what in your categorization, a human part where the AI is at a human level. I think you would put it into that categorization above human. It's not about innovation. I'm just talking about basic expertise on providing education, on providing health. In the rural areas, the quality of education is pathetic. The quality of health service, half the providers are not that. So I always thought that what I called expert system, we can call it now expert systems AI, was the way to go. And I'm still looking. I'm not really finding this. And any comments, direction, etc., which you have would be helpful, because I still have this problem. There's an old study which was done which showed that you can call them quacks, whatever, but half the advice which was given in rural areas was actually bad for health. And I've always felt that if we use this system, we can at least eliminate that negative and maybe raise the average to positive, something like that. So both on education and health. So anything you can advise or suggest on that would be very useful. The second one, which kind of Professor has mentioned, I think obviously we have to talk about the positive side, but there is a cost, right? In computing power, in energy usage. Now, of course, in crypto, everybody just completely forget about the energy used to create a piece of paper, which is, whatever it is worth. I don't know. Whatever people think it's worth. It's like almost like art, except for drug lords, etc., who find it very useful. But for AI, I mean, there's a cost side. So cost benefit, right? I haven't seen any study on that. So these are the two things which I would be interested in, but please address whatever comes to your mind here.
Great. Well, thank you both. I mean, so I think the examples you gave of applications of AI are really interesting and enrich the picture. It is fascinating to know what people are asking you, who are those of you who are experts, what to do, and so my overall reaction to that is, one, it's fascinating, and two, I think it's important to understand that the potential of these technologies, especially the Gen AI ones, goes well beyond standard conventional measures of economic performance, like productivity and growth. I mean, you could get very, very big benefits in healthcare and education. Arvind, I'll say a few more words about that. Take the doctor case, right? I mean, doctors are going to be freed up. They already are, from a fair amount of time that they quote waste. Now, it'd be great if they, spend the time doing what they do best, which is take care of patients. Maybe they'll play a little more golf. It's kind of hard to know. But anyway, we should value the leisure somehow. I think the point I'm trying to make is, and I learned, I learned this in India, now twice, right? I learned it, which is you solve problems that you have, okay? If we have labor shortages, then we'll use AI to try to overcome some of that. You don't have labor shortages in a lot of areas, so that's not the best way to use AI, and probably won't be the main source of requests, to you experts, in terms of, can you help us with this? I learned this the first time around from the private equity people. When they kind of showed up in various places, including India, the first instinct was to import a model that works somewhere else, right? Amazon did this, let's try it. And what they discovered is that didn't work very well. And what they really needed to do was to get people who had local knowledge and understood local problems and build systems using the same underlying technology, whether it's AI or something else, to solve a local problem, like improve the supply chains and logistics in the, somewhat fragmented retail, food, etc. And I believe that's the way it's going to go, right? So you won't solve the same problems in countries X, Y, Z, and W because they're not in the same set of conditions, they're not at the same stage of development, etc. And I think that's good, right? I mean, it's the way need to go. We focused on productivity in part because we do have kind of a growth problem and a supply side problem. But I didn't mean to suggest that it was completely general. I think there's going to be lots of writing on the healthcare side. There's just huge investments going into, the biomedical and life sciences, drug development, vaccines, healthcare. The two most recent Nobel Prizes in medicine went to this odd couple who developed the mRNA, technology that was used in the most successful. The fascinating thing about that, by the way, there's a picture in the slide deck that I had of these two, is that they were completely at the margins of the scientific community, working away on this, trying to develop something that helped with cancer because of targeting cancer cells. And, they had trouble getting funding and whatnot. I just think it's a wonderful story that, it's not always the establishment with the big bucks that gets the job done. Arvind, Salman Khan, who's, the founder of the Khan Academy, has written a book that's about to come out, in which I think, because he's spent so much time on the education side, and I believe the book is going to say, the Gen AI is going to revolutionize
I see.
the education industry. So I think that's a book that we're all going to want to read, and for its insights on the education side. But you're right to raise it. And but I think the reason I think he's particularly credible is he's been working at this for a long time and with considerable success. I know you have domestic companies as well who are in the education business, but at this stage, it's some cross between, we don't yet know, but the potential is probably pretty enormous.
Right.
On the ambient intelligence, I've been told that the big supply chain folks like Maersk are starting to use the Gen AI to, increase the transparency and visibility into these incredibly complex things called global supply chains. I mean, one of the problems with those supply chains is that they're constructed in a completely decentralized fashion, right? They're incredibly complex, and it's almost impossible to see the whole thing all at once. And even if you had all the data, a human being can't do that, right? We just don't have the capacity. And maybe the data will, a comprehensive, version of the thing with data, it will be part of the problem. But I think the other part of the problem is you can't assemble the pieces anyway. And the payoff from that is pretty large. I mean, if you look at the pandemic situation, I mean, one of the problems was nobody knew until it was too late what was going on. There were big, elements of congestion coming, but people still ordered the stuff for Christmas in September, and then finally found out they should have ordered it in May, right? So these things, you can increase the efficiency of systems with these sort of, powerful technologies that see through. And I think some of your comments were in that general direction. And there's multiple versions of that. So I've had, this whole discussion of, where the potential is. But just let me go back and with the final comment, which is, it really is sort of the right applications are context specific, right? You've got a ton of people you need to come from the traditional sectors into the modern economy over the next 2 to 3 decades.
Right.
You don't want a whole bunch of labor saving technology, kind of getting in the way of that. And that's just kind of different from other places. At some point, I think, at this stage, we got to admit we can have a sense of what direction we're going, but we're just going to have to find out over time.
Right.
The one thing I'll finish by saying something as an economist, which is when I go out and talk to people about jobs, they almost always do the following. 1, big productivity increase. 2, no change in demand. Okay. Therefore, reduction in the number of people, right? It's just a very strong instinct to hold only the other variables constant. But that's not how an economy works, right? It makes the calculation of whether you're going to get a net increase or decrease when you change the cost structures and don't really completely know the elasticities, income and price elasticities.
Yeah.
But the automation bias is very, very, it being the concern about job loss, under the heading of automation, even translated into the productivity version, is
Yeah.
very heavily biased by this tendency to hold the demand for whatever it is that's being produced constant.
Great. Let me take a few questions because we spent quite a bit of time. So we'll have it quick. I think Dr. Charan Singh wanted to, and maybe a few others. Charan?
Yes, I'll be very brief, Professor. It's been fascinating. I had an opportunity to listen to you when you were here in Delhi. And so that time too, I was fascinated by your presentation. And that's why we were so keen that you come and speak at our forum. Very quick questions. And as an economist, that's the earlier part of your presentation, which was more economic oriented. The question is, should we treat Maastricht Treaty as dead now? You know what all has happened, and you've shown the debt figures. And looking at that, this was the thought. Coming on to the main subject of the day that you have spent so much time.
Maastricht. Okay.
This is the question is in the same league as has been asked by Professor Dinesh. I was looking from the other side of it. You and me as economists are familiar with something called disguised unemployment.
Yep.
And I'm worried with the AI coming up and providing the type of productivity gains that it does, would we end up people getting their purchasing power and getting able to sustain their demand, but have nothing much to do? And then how do you engage the young, bright minds? And where are they up to? So this AI, which is hitting, and your prediction is again number of jobs lost, but there are certain studies which have shown that AI would replace 40% of the present jobs, which is for a country like India, for a country with enjoying a demographic dividend, becomes a very big challenge. And how much to apply, because it's not the government that's playing a role in its application, as Professor Dinesh was mentioning to you, it's the private sector which is jumping onto it to save their cost and enhance their profit. So where do you then say, okay, this is where we need to cut off and no more? Thank you.
Charan, should we take a few more questions because we've really gone quite a bit?
Absolutely.
Is there anybody else you see who we need to give a chance?
There are a few questions in the chat. I don't know whether we would like to pick a few of them. There are quite a few.
We can tell one question to Professor Jena, and we can ask one question to Professor Alok Pandey. And I think with that,
Professor Pandey and then Professor Jena. Professor Pandey?
I think, sir, it was a wonderful lecture. And I believe that Professor Spence has brought out lots of issues. But what about the recent bill which has been introduced by a senator in the US, where the copyright part would be essential now before they start training their AI systems? Right now they're having a free run, right? They are getting everything for free. And I really believe that. And another thing is that generative AI is a very minor thing, and we basically need to move towards the artificial general intelligence in a broader term in long run, and companies are not putting enough money into AGI as much they are putting into generative AI because it is helping them make money. So your views on both these issues, sir?
Thank you. Professor Jena?
Yeah. Good afternoon, sir. Am I audible, sir?
Yeah.
Yeah. My video, I think, is not. Yeah. So
it's okay. Why don't you just ask the question?
Yeah. Just I want to know, like in the people, like country like India, there are a lot of like unemployment issue is now the peak. So if you will start using like AI, then how the government is going to tackle it? And the second question is that AI is destroying a lot of creativeness. How it is going to replace it? These are the two specific questions.
So, Mike, you've already answered the employment question, but anyway, whatever you want to respond, yeah.
Sure. So I'll just take them in sort of order. The copyright
Yeah.
issue is a huge issue. So these things are trained on the internet. They've had free access to essentially the entire internet. The internet made this stuff available, in the pre-Gen AI large language model era. And so we didn't anticipate this. The Hollywood people are terrified, and they're right. And one of the really hard problems is to sort out the copyright issues, so that people who have generated original content, aren't basically marginalized by the, free use of their creative talents. And so that's an issue that, that bill, is an attempt to deal with. I think it's a hard problem because you want to balance, right? You don't want to cut them off. But on the other hand, you can't just, sort of say, well, anybody who produced a piece of art or music or film, has to make it available to some large, generative AI model so that they can hoover it up and use it. There's a lot of other issues. We've talked about employment and copyright. I think, if I were to put a list up, it's pretty long. And it's the same list everybody else has. That at the top of the list, would be an international agreement to ban fully autonomous weapons. I think they're just plain dangerous. And I hope that gets done in the next few years. We already have, human-guided weapons with considerable capabilities. That's one thing, and large mistakes are made with that. But fully autonomous weapons are just out of the. And we have treaties with respect to nuclear weapons and biological and chemical weapons. There's no reason why we can't have treaties, that prevent that kind of thing. On the Maastricht Treaty, this is going to be interesting if you live in Europe, where I live. So it's out of date in multiple ways. One, is nobody pays attention to the restrictions when it's inconvenient, starting with Germany. And so they just kind of do what they want. But the second is rather more interesting. So Mario Draghi, who everybody knows, has been focused recently. I think he even has an assignment from the European Commission to look into this, but he wrote a very influential article in The Economist back in, I think it was around June of 2023, in which he basically said, the world where, the euro came into existence and the Maastricht Treaty was put into place isn't the world we're living in. We're living in a world in which we need very large combinations of public sector and private sector investment to accomplish huge structural transformations of our economy. In the energy sector. And I think you all know, China and the United States have all the major platforms with cloud computing systems that are big enough to train AIs. Now, India will end up with one in the not too distant future. Europe doesn't have one, which is stunning. And so in other dimensions, we're behind in digital and other areas. And one of the reasons we're behind, and this is Draghi's point, is we have a very big economy that is not integrated fiscally. And so the right way, to go about this is to make public sector investments at the center, okay, in not complete fiscal centralization, just the big important things like the science, the technology, the infrastructure they need to pursue it. Maybe it's 10%. That we should fund and administer centrally, but we're not doing it. And as long as we keep not doing it, then we will basically continue to fall behind, the places that operate as a kind of unit, the China's, the United States, the Indias, et cetera, the major economies. And so what Draghi is saying is basically we need a completely different framework than the one that was envisaged in when the Maastricht Treaty came into existence. And whether or not, this point of view succeeds in Europe, I think is a first order importance in terms of its future trajectory. Not next year. I mean, next year we're going to struggle. We're struggling already. We've got, the Ukraine war and all that kind of stuff to deal with. But longer term, there's big structural changes that are needed, and we are going to fall behind because we're not going to be able to deliver the public sector investment. When I'm talking to my European colleagues about this, I say, let me explain to you what you're doing in the American context. Okay. So in the American context, we have, the Energy Department, the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation with great big budgets, right? That build the kind of, upstream science and technology base of the economy. And then it gets picked up by the private sector and, and et cetera. Everybody knows the model. So suppose the United States said, well, the federal government will no longer do this. We'll let California, Texas, New York, and Massachusetts do it instead. Okay. Then what would we get? Answer: lower, suboptimally low levels of investment and inefficient investment, because the Californians would focus it on California, and the New Yorkers and Texans would focus it on Texas. Well, that's what we're doing in Europe, right? If we're going to get any of these investments now, because we keep, relying on this fiscal decentralization. So I hope Draghi is successful, because it really makes a difference in the kind of longer term. On disguised unemployment, I basically just agree with you. I don't think, employment destroying applications of this technology are particularly useful in India. Honestly, I know there's a bias. There really is, including in the private sector. I think people who do this are going to, find they make mistakes, right? So suppose even in the developed countries, suppose you deploy this technology, have a big productivity increase, gives you some kind of competitive edge, and then you sort of cut out a bunch of people and discover, 2 years from now, you really needed them, right? Then, it's just, I think there's a learning curve is what I'm trying to say, right? But in the Indian context, the adoption of purely labor-saving technology, the incentives will be just completely different, I would imagine, than they are in a place that's experiencing labor shortages. So I'm not saying that's sufficient, but I'm saying, I don't think the incentive structures are completely misaligned in this area. At least I hope that's true. I realize I'm saying two things at the same time. One, there is a very powerful automation bias. It's what Eric Bernelson calls the Turing trap, right? When you benchmark AIs against humans, which is a natural thing to do, then the next step's the really dangerous one. And the next step is when the AI passes the average human, then let's get rid of the human. And that's kind of where this, so I don't want to dismiss the notion that there's a potential risk here. It's just, if we strongly sell the idea that these are really powerful digital assistants, they're meant to be there to help people, do something better, whether it's productivity or something else. I think we'll probably come out okay.
Thank you. Yeah. Charan, I think we've had a long discussion. I mean, we could go on for several hours, unfortunately. But if you don't mind, I do have to.
Sure.
Yeah. Thank Mike. It's really a pleasure. And as I said, we could probably have divided it into 2 talks and had 1.5 hours for each. But anyway, I'm afraid I'm also sorry to the other people who asked questions. We haven't from the chat. But Charan, let me hand it over to you.
So thank you very much for chairing this session. And Professor Michael, so kind of you to accept our invite. I would like to mention end of May, we are doing a conference on digital economy. And Professor Michael, we'll send you the dates. We are willing to switch a date a day here or there. We would really like you to come and address, of course, online. So we would like you to address us online, because I've just realized today earlier the interest of the people in what you're talking and your honest acceptance of challenges, including the risks involved, or a country like India disguised unemployment, I think are very, very genuine and very mature approach to this new scientific innovation which is taking place. Really like you to come and address, and we'll come back to you on the exact dates and look
I
at
would
how
enjoy that.
you can do that. Yeah. I would also like to mention Professor Dinesh. I had approached him very, very recently. I knew he's not an economist, but this topic was so technical, and he is a leading expert in the country on digital issues, and that's why we invited him. Thank you, Professor Dinesh, for accepting such a late invitation and coming and speaking to us. And we are going to extend you the invite for our digital conference to you too. Hope you will accept it.
It was my pleasure, Professor, and I enjoyed Professor Michael and a lot of insights. And I could connect AI with economics now, how both are working together, right?
Absolutely.
And I've read your paper twice to understand from economic perspective what is going on, what kind of trouble ChatGPT or large language model is creating. So I have much better
Well,
clarity now.
I don't know,
thank
Professor
you for
Dinesh.
your insights.
Professor Dinesh, I don't know if you have faced this problem, but I also still teach at IIM Rohtak and sometimes at Visakhapatnam. My students have started writing essays based on ChatGPT, and that's very worrisome. You have a worry to place them. I was having a worry, how do I rate them now relatively to others? Okay.
So one of my colleague, what he did, he gave the ChatGPT version of the answer essay, and then say, okay, now write differently.
Brilliant. I should. Okay, I should make an announcement. Next 2 Fridays, we are dedicating to poverty, because all of you know that in India, we have released the multidimensional poverty data, and we had the consumption expenditure survey data recently. Based on these two, and who could be the best to come and speak to us on this? We have invited Professor Nanak Kakwani, who's a global expert on poverty. He will be the keynote speaker. Dr. Arvind Virmani has been working on this in the Planning Commission and earlier. He will be chairing the session, and we will tell you who will be the discussants in both the sessions. So I would like to invite all of you to please, and we'll send you the timing. It will be between 4 and 5:30. We would have Nanak Kakwani, and we would request all of you to kindly spare time to be with us. There's one last announcement which we want to make. We are trying to spread financial literacy across the country. So every evening, 7:30 to 8:30 p.m., we do 1 hour of class. The classes are taken by the best minds in our country, because these are on financial markets in India. This is on macroeconomics in general, also law and economics. These type of issues we cover. So we have chief economist of some institutions speaking, retired people from the Central Bank of people from the universities, including Delhi University and JNU. There are people who are volunteering to speak, and they give us about 1 hour every day. So every evening, 7:30 to 8:30 p.m., we do these classes, very nominally charged. In case somebody can't afford it, we waive the fees also. We would like you to spread the word. We would request you to send young faculty as well as your PhD students and other scholars, even including aspirants for civil services, to join our courses 7:30 to 8:30. With that, let me then conclude by once again thanking Professor Michael Spence to be with us, thanking Professor Dinesh to be with us, and thanking our chairman and Dr. Virmani to chair the session. See you next
Thank you.
week. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody.